The Capital Confidential podcast is brought to you by the Times-Union, the leading newspaper in New York's capital region. Subscribe today or visit online at timesunion.com.
You want to deport an undocumented person? Start with me, because I'm an undocumented person.
How do we beat him in an election?
We will. I'm going to run against him.
I wish you would. I wish you would, Dad. I would.
There are things in here that are unobjectionable because they're not that effective. So yeah, sure, I'll vote for a distinctive license plate. Sure, why not?
Jim, you had your press conference at 4 o'clock.
You're having a press conference now?
That's
You're
right.
talking?
I'm having a press conference.
Well,
now.
is this your space here or is it public?
No, it's my space.
Oh, this is your
Don't
space.
interrupt.
Okay.
I'm David Lombardo, and this is the Capital Confidential podcast. On this episode, we're going deep into the governor's proposed framework for recreational marijuana in New York, which is poised to be one of the big issues in budget negotiations with lawmakers. Our guide for the journey is Christopher Beals, president of Weedmaps, the Yelp for the pot industry. The interview focuses on how New York can create a successful market, looks at what consumers might be able to expect, and explores Weedmaps' role in all of this. Enjoy the show. New York is poised to approve some system of adult use marijuana this year. So as someone who's been through this before, seen what other states have done, what are some of the major hurdles that legislators will have to address as they negotiate a framework in the coming months?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's going to benefit New York is the fact that there's a lot of other precedents for other states that have taken this step, and you can see the states that are really failing in certain aspects and states that are being successful. And so that's a huge benefit. I think the big issue for New York, I think, is going to be taking those observations of what's working in other states, looking at the increasing amount of empirical data that exists on sort of what aspects of legalization work. And I should note that generally, that data has tended to show that many of the sort of ills that people, commonly associate with marijuana legalization simply aren't statistically supported. So, claims of increases in crime rates, decrease in home values, increase in youth usage, the studies have shown actually the exact opposite is true. But leaving that aside for a moment, I think as New York goes to embark on legalization, often states forget the fact that cannabis exists in all of these jurisdictions already. So what's being decided is not the choice between are we going to allow cannabis or not, but rather are we going to create a safe and regulated market that's sufficiently robust to eliminate the illegal market. And so, that's I think a fundamental difference that influences a lot of the policy. You can obviously treat cannabis like plutonium or some other dangerous substance in how you legalize it, but that's ultimately going to thwart the goal of making the legal market better priced, more efficient alternative to the illegal market.
Besides availability and price, what else does New York need to think about when it's competing with the illegal market as well as, just neighboring states?
The single strongest indicator for how large the illegal market will be is simply retail density. And so we've generally found that if your retail density falls below one retailer per 7,500 to 10,000 people, you're going to see a very solid uptick in the illegal market rate. And you really don't go too far before you reach a point where, law enforcement or sort of judicial action alone is insufficient to tamp down that illegal market. That being said, other factors that I think have made a difference, obviously taxation and tax rate. A number of states have made some real mistakes with layering taxation through the supply chain without really understanding how multiplicative tax rates work. Other issues are other sort of convenience factors, home delivery, the ability to have a robust medical system. I think we'll start to see sort of a higher grade or more restrictive testing standards for medical products. Product selection. One area that's been a real driver of a legal market in certain jurisdictions is when they have broad categorical restrictions on certain product types. So they don't allow concentrate, or they don't allow smokable flower or edibles. And generally consumers have an affinity for certain things, and if they can't buy it off the legal market, they'll buy it on the illegal market. And then the other thing that we're going to start to see that I think is really important is the rise of social consumption lounges. I think social consumption lounges and the ability to have a a monitored social place to consume cannabis has, or at least we hypothesize, and we have some anecdotal evidence, has a really strong impact on driving people towards the legal market. It's for the same reason that when people go out for a drink with friends, they don't do that in the basement, they do it at the local watering hole. And if you look at places like the Barcelona market where they have these sort of cannabis social clubs, the cannabis social clubs really serve as sort of a glue spot for neighborhoods and where folks come to watch soccer matches on Saturdays, and that sort of thing. And it's had a strong impact on pulling people into that sort of model.
So turning to New York, what's your take on the governor's plan? Where is he getting things right and where is he getting things wrong?
A broad thing that New York is really getting right is they've left a lot of flexibility in there with allowing sort of regulators to help define aspects of it more. And that's the one thing we highlight to a lot of state and local jurisdictions is flexibility. Nobody will get this right out of the gate. And so having the ability to iterate, to adjust retail density, to adjust cultivator or manufacturer density on the fly is important. Having the ability to go back and deal with certain other aspects of how lab testing is handled. That's been a very big sticking point in certain jurisdictions. Labeling requirements, things like that, require, I think, a very nuanced and nimble approach. So that's been great. I think the fact that New York stayed away from set caps is really critical.
What do you mean by that?
So not putting specific caps on the maximum number of licenses that can occur in a jurisdiction.
Okay.
That's where a lot of state and local, and frankly in Canada, provincial jurisdictions have kind of tied their shoelaces together, is setting an arbitrary density or sort of cap on the number of licenses and then finding that that's not enough. And at that point, it's really difficult to go and increase those caps. I think the future, the trend of what we are seeing, and for instance, this happened in Massachusetts and it's being considered in other states, is actually a flooring system. So in Massachusetts, the legislation essentially says that if your city voted 50% or more yes on the ballot initiative, you must have at least one cannabis retailer for every 5 liquor stores within your jurisdiction, or you have to go back to the voters. And we're seeing other cities start to do that because one of the single biggest sticking points for having an efficient market, and we have seen very few instances of cities getting it right, but is local control and local cities effectively adopting a NIMBY attitude. And the thing is that when cities say, well, we're not going to allow a legal market to come into this city, what folks aren't fully appreciating is they're taking these negative externalities of having a huge illegal market and injecting it onto the surrounding cities. So they're not going to have adequate density. They're not going to have a way to meet consumer demand. And so potentially they're pushing tax and job base over to surrounding cities, but more often than not, they're pushing the problem that they're fostering an illegal market by not creating sufficient density. And so I think that's going to be one of the big issues for New York is figuring out how to deal with the local control issue when for many local legislators, it's easier to say no than to sort of, I think actively engage and put in the effort and time to understand the issue and effectively regulate it.
So do you think then it's a mistake to have that opt-out provision in the budget?
The point of cannabis legalization is to not take a community where there's absolutely no desire for this to be there or for where there may not be a consumer base and force it there. But on the flip side, we know that, the statistics are relatively uniform across jurisdictions and that cannabis consumption and demand is uniform regardless of how conservative the area is. And so, to some degree, well, I guess to state it more strongly, in short, yes, I think giving too much leeway to local governments to not participate in cannabis legalization is asking for what we would call, cannabis deserts, these broad swaths where people have to drive hours to get to the nearest retailer. That both hurts, the ability to create a viable legal market that tamps down the illegal market, but then trailing off of that, it thwarts, any of the other goals you have around cannabis legalization, whether it be addressing historical social justice issues, whether it be generating taxes, increasing the job base in that region, ensuring safety of consumer product. All of these other things are thwarted by not having a sufficiently robust legal market that tamps down the illegal market.
And what do you think about the tax structure proposed by the governor, as well as his projection that the state could be looking at $300 million in annual revenue at one point?
Well, so, on the tax estimates, that's not I would say in the long tail sense, that's probably a low tax estimate. I think it's possible to beat and exceed those numbers. However, I think that a huge item on which that hinges is how much cities actually move forward with allowing licensees to operate in their jurisdiction. Pretty much every case where we've seen states miss on tax revenue numbers, it's because they've essentially screwed up the license density. The devil is in the details on taxes. I think one thing that's going to be an issue and states have struggled with, which New York has in the current proposal, is this idea of taxation further up the supply chain on cultivated cannabis. This has generally just been a nightmare for states that have tried to go with it because especially when they're weight-based taxation systems, cannabis weight varies dramatically from when it's harvested to after it's cured in terms of water weight. And because this is a non-shelf stable agricultural product, that loss of water weight continues throughout the entire cycle. Additionally, as you take that cannabis product and say convert it into concentrate or other distillates, there's a very nuanced amount of math that goes into what the yields are. So, for instance, if you have, cannabis flower, you could potentially get a 20% yield by weight off of that dry plant material or biomass, as they call it in the trade. But if you're using stems and sort of green leaf matter, your yield could be sub 5%. And so having like a weight-based tax on plant matter is really difficult because the commercial value of that plant matter varies dramatically, and that's not captured. The weight of that plant matter through its processing and life cycle varies dramatically. That's not captured. And the other thing is when that tax is not percentage-based, we see without exception, in the long run, a drop in wholesale prices. And the wholesale prices and correspondingly margins drop, but those flat tax rates don't. And then I think the other real issue with that is you're going from, most what I would characterize as third generation legalization states are focusing on a tax just at the retail level.
Right.
And it's much simpler in the context that you have one point of the supply chain where you're taxing. It's much easier to set uniform regulations on tax collection, and these other sort of ancillary pieces. These up supply chain taxes have just turned into I think a really unwieldy spaghetti monster, and one that frankly, makes the viability of these businesses, a little bit more difficult.
So it sounds like what you're saying is the easiest and probably, I don't know if you're recommending it, but would be to do just a simple tax at the retail sale level?
Generally, our recommendation, and what we have observed to work best in jurisdictions, is one tax at the sale level. And if you want to sort of cover the administrative or other costs for other layers of the supply chain, that can be accomplished through licensure and licensure renewal fees. But trying to layer taxes up at those other layers is incredibly difficult, adds a lot of complexity, and turns into a much higher net effective tax rate than most legislators actually realize. So this actually ties to another issue, which is what I would characterize as third generation legalization states are more and more moving towards prohibited local jurisdictions from adding additional layers of taxation, or they've capped that taxation. And when you actually do the math and look at that multiplicative tax rate going through the supply chain, by the time it hits a retailer or a consumer's hands and you add on the 15% state excise tax at retail as well as the applicable local excise tax, you can get a net effective tax rate that approaches 100%.
So with the caveat that, like you're saying, there are regulations in New York will likely be drafted by regulators and not solely contained in the budget language, what could New York consumers expect from a market in the state? Can you kind of describe what the landscape might look like in terms of, what's the shopping experience like? What products can people buy? How expensive might things be?
The really nice thing about a state like New York that effectively is starting from scratch in terms of having a retail market, and I say that acknowledging the fact that there is a very stunted medical market in New York, but for all intents and purposes, there is not a a true cannabis market that exists on any sense of scale in New York. I think really what you can expect to see is, especially with these newer businesses, they're generally well funded, they're well thought out. They look much more akin to an upscale coffee shop than they look to anything people kind of associate with some sort of like hole in the wall, like corner bodega type thing. So generally, to the extent zoning restrictions allow it, we're starting to see these businesses go on commercial corridors. We're seeing them become anchors of commercial corridors, and there's studies showing that consumer foot traffic, average real estate prices all sort of rise when you put a cannabis retailer on these districts.
What can you expect on the inside?
Because these businesses are going to be tied to a pretty strict set of regulations and compliance requirements, these businesses are very focused on sort of maintaining compliance, staying within the guidelines that are set. So generally, you're going to see a pretty tight IDing system, potentially even a waiting room to vet that in some cases up front, or at the very least a fairly rigorous check-in process. And then once you're inside, the move has been more towards cases where you can see the products clearly, bud tenders or sort of retail clerks that are knowledgeable on the product and are going around. We're starting to see a movement towards kind of mobile checkout devices and iPads, things that you might see in like a tech or electronics store. And also a lot of these businesses are moving towards electronic catalogs and also electronic ordering systems where you could place an order on a digital platform for delivery, or you could order ahead for pickup and you go in and there's a will call area and you pick it up. I also think that as you move towards this future state, assuming that the licensing is sufficient on the supply chain side, you're going to see a broadening of the number of markets. Or on the number of products. You're going to see products and brands that have existed in other states starting to enter the market, as well as a number of New York-specific products. I think a really big area of opportunity for New York, I think given the rich agricultural tradition, is the generation of strong brands that have New York ties that then can project outwards to other states, and sort of bring ancillary revenue back to New York.
When people head into a store, should they be packing their pockets with cash, or do you anticipate these businesses will be able to accept credit cards?
Yeah, so that's really still one of the big issues for the industry. I mean, even for, fully licensed stores and fully licensed states, access to banking is still an issue. More and more stores are finding ways to work around that. But for a lot of these stores, you're still dealing with an ATM in the store where you can take out cash if you haven't brought any. But we are seeing states make meaningful steps on banking. You can start to pay with debit cards. You can start to pay with potentially credit cards. Although the real issue with credit cards is you simply just can't process credit cards openly because the big payment networks, Amex, Visa, MasterCard, as a policy don't accept cannabis money. So to the extent you're seeing a store accepting credit card, somebody in the payment processing chain is not being 100% honest with somebody up above them in that chain. And that's, the uncomfortable truth, I think, of where things stand.
So I'd like to pivot and talk a little bit about your business. Tell me a little about what Weedmaps does.
We're 10 years old. We're the oldest and largest SaaS and technology company that focuses on the cannabis space. And I think while a lot of people are familiar with our core information platform that's business to consumer facing, we have a number of other offerings, and a lot of our products are actually more in the business segment. We do a whole host of stuff. We consider our domain sort of end-to-end software and compliance solutions from the guy putting clones in the ground all the way down through the end consumer.
So talk to me about how most consumers will use Weedmaps, which is an app which I actually just downloaded for my phone. So tell me what the app does.
What we're trying to do with the app is take as much information and verified information as possible and put it in the hands of the consumer. So that includes on the information and content side. We have a news site and news portal that enables folks to read news and get the latest information. We have a learn platform that lets people dive deep on understanding what is cannabis, how do I consume it, what are the effects, that sort of thing. Then pivoting over with the brands platform, we're enabling people to research and understand the products that are on the shelf before they go into the stores. We're also launching a strains feature. More and more people are getting away from thinking of cannabis through the strains paradigm and instead focusing on the brand and brand SKU paradigm, because that's really the future of where this is going. Each brand is making its own unique products. But for folks who want to think about it through the strain lens, we'll be launching content and the ability to sort of search via that framework in the next month or so. And then as it relates to individual stores, you can go on Weedmaps and see we integrate often with their own with a third-party point-of-sale system that they use, or if they're using one of our point-of-sale systems, our own point-of-sale system, so that you can get real-time inventory and menuing, pricing. You can see, to the extent they have it available, lab data and testing data, deals, photos of the store, and then customer reviews on the individual, not just the store, but the individual products that the store is carrying. And it's this kind of rich data that folks and consumers really care about. And this is doubly important, I think, in jurisdictions where perhaps retail density isn't as high as it should be, and folks are potentially having to drive an hour and a half to get to the nearest retailer. But really, for us, having all that information, the reason it's so important is, again, this is a non-shelf stable agricultural product. This has seasonality. What's in one store will not be in another store, or what's there one week will not be there another week. And so, that's something that a lot of folks in states that haven't brought full legalization don't realize it yet.
So I was in Colorado last year and experienced a shop for the first time, and I found it overwhelming. So what would your advice be for someone who is going into a recreational marijuana shop, and how can they make sure that it's a successful or happy visit that's not overwhelming and they come out satisfied with their purchases?
Yeah, I think people fall in a couple different camps. I think for folks who have never really been in a store before and are figuring things out, I think going online, looking at the store menu, looking at the reviews on the individual products that are on the shelf, reading about what's there is big, because you can go in and understand what's there in advance. And when you're there with the movement, and when you're at a retailer with the movement towards, I think, much glossier packaging and that sort of thing, sometimes it's almost, and I have to admit, I experience this still, it's easy to get lost in kind of the dizzying array of products and packaging and in-store displays and that sort of thing. And so I think, kind of reading in advance and understanding what's there is really important. And I think the other thing is retailers more and more are getting really good at having their store clerks and bud tenders trained on, well, here are these different products. These are what they do. And so feeling comfortable just saying, hey, I have some questions. I want to understand what is this? Or, for a medicinal purpose, I'm looking to treat insomnia or chronic pain. What are people using for that sort of thing? And just using them as an information resource is really helpful. But, I think for most people, the thing that helps the most is just going online in advance and reading, looking at the store menu, looking at the products, looking at the SKUs. It's almost to the point now where usually before, instead of going into a store and just deciding on the moment, I'll use the order ahead feature, and I'll just order ahead what I want and know that I can go in and pick up a bag, and I don't have to deal with, the pressure or stress of, people asking me what I'm looking for and sort of feeling like I'm holding them up from helping somebody else.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate your time and expertise in walking us through all this, and I'd love to check in next year when it looks like we actually have some shops open in New York.
That sounds great.
Just heard I tried to get you.
This day sucks.